It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to say at the start just two things about this place. The first is that when Richard Erikson was being remembered by his colleagues upon his passing, Ian Hacking, who is probably Canada's greatest philosopher, living or dead, made the following simple observation about Green College and about Richard Erikson. He said, quote, "Richard created what was probably the best graduate college in the world," end quote. It's simple, and I think Ian Hacking was probably right. And I think we owe a debt not only to Mr. Green, who contributed to this place so generously, but to both Richard Erikson and to Mark Vesey, who's really been up to the task of maintaining this good place at that great standard. And I want to say, for the people who are residents here now, that Mark is an unrelentingly reliable source of information and wisdom and guidance when you enter your academic career. Good humor as well, and a good bit of sarcasm to get you through the conversation when you're trying to make tough decisions. And I sincerely recommend his counsel to everyone. If I can say something more personal, is that the year and a bit that I spent at Green College was fundamental to me as a person and to me as an academic. And I always leave here with two questions. One is, how did I get so lucky that I could live right beside the Pacific Ocean and eat well every day and have all of my needs taken care of? And when can I return? So it's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I want to talk about today is why people vote. And in particular, I want to speak about what motivates some individuals to trot off to their polling stations and express their democratic preferences. Some do it at considerable cost and effort, considerable inconvenience, even in democratic countries. You can think here of the many people in the United States who face substantial barriers to voting still, even in just proving their eligibility to cast a ballot. So what motivates such individuals to vote? Well, others couldn't care less, letting each election pass them by with no interest, with no thought, and with no guilt. This has been a question that's been central to my research for some time. And what I wish to do today is say something about how the insights from behavioral economics can teach us about why people participate electorally. So I'd like to begin then with a quote from the first and still greatest behavioral economist, Adam Smith. And near the front end of his Theory of Moral Sentiments, perhaps his best book, Smith makes a great observation about human beings. He says the following: "However selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like all the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous and humane, though they perhaps may feel it with the most exquisite sensibility. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it." But if Smith here speaks of the redeeming nature of humans, elsewhere in the book he underlines just how stupid we are, how we overvalue the things which we have in our hands at some moment, how we massively discount the future, how we cannot understand how some things are more likely than they seem and others are much the opposite. So these two facts about humans, that we care about others and that we are a bit dumb, are at the core of my explanation of why we vote. To understand why people vote, we have to first recognize how paradoxical the action is. And we must recognize that voting is a small act. The act of a single individual going to a polling station is obviously inconsequential. One vote rarely, if ever, makes a difference. But it is the many votes in aggregate that act to remove governments, to peacefully change regimes, and in large part to decide the future paths of countries. So voting matters. The paradox runs in the other direction too. We often have a hard time making sense of the aggregation of votes. What does it mean for a country when 40% of people vote Tory and the rest split between parties of the center and center-left? Exactly what sort of message is that? What does it mean when 47% of people vote for Rob Ford in Toronto, for that matter? But if there's not clarity in the meaning at the aggregate level, there is clarity at the level of the individual. Their preference is clearly expressed on that small piece of paper that they drop into the ballot box. And if the decision to vote really interests me, it's because it's a small act that tells us something about individuals' values. It's like so many other democratic and civic acts, small in isolation, grand in aggregation, seemingly trivial, but in fact deeply revealing of an individual's values. These are the things a democracy and a civil society are built from. It's a bit like watching the small things people do around this college every day. It's also the small nature of voting which makes it interesting and amenable to behavioral approaches. Because it is small and seemingly inconsequential, it's likely to be regulated by the mistakes individuals routinely make when they make small decisions. But because it is as often something expressive as it is something instrumental, it's also an act for which fundamental differences between individuals, not least their sympathies for others, can play a role. So why do people vote? Well, let's start with the bad news. The reality is humans are a bit dumb. It's true, and it's particularly obvious when we look at the choices that they make. And I'm not referring here to the subjective content of people's choices, the preference for one party over another, one hockey team over another, one college over another. By the way, I was placed at St. John's College to stay here. I didn't realize there was another college on campus, but it was nice to know. So I'm not referring to the subjective content of choices. Instead, I refer to the tendency of human beings to make choices that they themselves, in a state of reflection, would not make. Behavioral economists have cataloged a long list of such mistakes, and they've monikered them anomalies. So I'd like to tell you about two such anomalies. The first is something called ambiguity aversion, and this refers to the human preference for known risks over unknown risks. And it's manifest every day in important ways, not least in stock market volatility and in how we drop contracts. The classic demonstration of ambiguity aversion is the following. Suppose I tell you that I have a Greek urn filled with 30 red balls and 60 yellow and black balls. The respective proportion of the yellow and black balls is unknown. Now, you might ask me, what's a Greek urn? And I'll respond, about €300 a week, but focus on the task, because that's irrelevant right now. So I would then ask you, suppose that we will, it's a classic statistics joke. There's only 3, and that's one of them. The other one has to do with dummies and sex, and I can tell you at lunch. Okay, so the economists will get that one. So then I would ask you the following. Suppose we will conduct a draw in which you have a choice between receiving $135 for a red ball. Remember, there are 30 of them. $150 for a yellow ball, or $150 for a black ball. Remember, there's 60 of those combined. What do you choose? Well, the rational choice is to choose either a yellow ball or a black ball, because even though you don't know their individual proportions, they present to you a greater expected payoff. However, a good many subjects will choose the red ball because they know their odds of winning with a red ball. Such individuals, fine as they might be, are simply bad at math. As it turns out, being bad at math is good for voter turnout. You see, one truth about voting is that your vote will rarely matter, because you'll rarely ever be in a position to cause a tie or to break a tie. In other words, the probability that your vote will be decisive is very low, vanishingly small, in fact. But if you're bad at math, particularly if you're bad at probabilities, then you're less likely to know this, and you should be more likely to vote. So my colleague, Chris Dawes from NYU, and I have administered this ambiguity aversion question in a large survey of Swedish adults. They're generally a smart group, and we gave them real choices in their participation in this draw, and then we estimated econometrically what the relationship was between their ambiguity aversion and their likelihood of participating in Swedish politics, which we know from electoral records, I should know. So there's no shortage of them who are ambiguity averse, I should tell you. And our empirical models suggest that those individuals are measurably more likely to vote. They make their vote count because they can't count. And if humans are poor with probabilities, they're even worse at valuing things in the future. Humans are, in the language of behavioral economists, hyperbolic discounters. We value the future much less than we should. And this causes us no shortage of problems, not least in personal health, in financial planning, and in saving our planet. It's good for voter turnout, however. Elections matter, and there's a substantial body of academic research that demonstrates that parties differ in how they govern, such that conservative parties will spend less and spend differently than liberal parties. This matters for voters and it matters for elections, because elections are the mechanisms by which we decide which party will distribute benefits, how much, and to whom. But if the choices of elections are made in the present, while benefits are distributed in the future, then this creates a problem. Those who do not care about the future will be less likely to vote. Again, this is what my colleague Chris Dawes and I find, using data from Sweden, from the United States, from Canada, and from the United Kingdom, eliciting discount rates with real money on the table. Our results suggest that the impatient, those who discount the future more steeply, vote at something like 4/5 of the rate of their more patient counterparts. If humans make the wrong choices, that is, the choices they would not make given sufficient self-reflection, they do redeem themselves in other ways. Humans do vote because of their inability to make rational calculations, but they also vote because they feel concern for other people. The decision theory of elections is clear. Whatever benefits may be received by an individual, their likelihood of being decisive is essentially zero. So the expected benefits of voting are also vanishingly small. Voting is essentially a collective action problem, and there's no rational reason to vote. And yet millions of people do. This is the so-called paradox of voter turnout, and as Bernie Grofman put it, it is this paradox that nearly ate rational choice theory. So political scientists spent a great deal of time trying to resolve this paradox. Some pointed out that voters might vote to maintain democracy. Others have noted the strong sense of duty which many voters express, and which obviously shuffles their feet to the polls. But only recently did it occur to us, shamefully late I must say, that perhaps people vote not only because they care about benefits to themselves, but perhaps they care about benefits to other people. Elections are, after all, contests between different groups of people. Parties have bases of support, which can be differentiated according to who votes for the parties, union members for the NDP, small business people for the Tories, etc. The rhetoric of parties underlines this understanding, emphasizing the groups who will benefit from this or that policy, the groups who will pay for this or that policy. And finally, voters use the same concepts of identification towards parties that they use towards other social groupings, overestimating the size of the group to which they belong, attributing to it positive characteristics that they don't attribute to other groups. So if elections are a competition between groups, then we have to ask how voters' affinity for some groups and their antipathy for others motivates their decision to vote. Recent work of others and of colleagues and myself has looked at this extensively. We begin from the insight that if I derive utility from the benefits of others, if I have social preferences in the parlance of behavioral economics, or if I have sympathy for others, in the words of Adam Smith, then it does not matter that my vote has very small chances of being decisive. In the rare event that it is, it benefits not only me, but thousands and millions of others. It's the aggregation of this expected utility of others that allows me to overcome the cost of voting, that I take happiness from seeing them and not myself enriched. It's my sympathy which motivates me to vote. And my colleagues and I have now examined this in every Anglo-American democracy. Our approach is behavioral. We first give subjects an opportunity to reveal to us whether they care about other people by way of their allocations in dictator games in both classic and modified forms. In these games, we give one individual money, and we tell them that money can be shared with another individual with the distribution of their choosing, which can include an allocation of 0 to the other individual. We will occasionally tell them the characteristics of that individual or change the payoff structure. And it allows us to observe behaviorally, with real money on the table, how much subjects care about the well-being of other people at a cost to themselves. And once we've elicited this concern for others, we use these data to predict political participation. We estimate it with the same sorts of econometric models we use to estimate the relationship between ambiguity, aversion, and turnout, or discounting and turnout. And the story is always the same, always the same. Voters who care about other people, whether they're on the right, the left, or in the center, are more likely to vote than their egoist counterparts in every country, everywhere we look. So if voters vote because they're dumb, They also vote because they care about other people. And in the small act of voting, they signal what they value and what motivates them. However ugly our politics may be, this leaves us with a nice picture of humanity and a nice picture of our fellow citizens. So thank you very much.
Way in the back. So is that a surprising finding for you that people who have conservative politics are nonetheless more likely to vote if they have a generous mindset and one-on-one games?
No, it's not terribly surprising to me. I mean, it's even altruism isn't overly, so if you play behavioral games, dictator games across political ideology, people on the left are more generous, slightly so. People on the right are more generous as well. They just don't like government distribution of money as an expression of altruism. But as it pertains to their participation, they use the same motivation as those on the left. Concern for other people, and the desire to see those other people do well by an election. Those people aren't the poor, by the way. But, yeah.
So the obvious question is, why people don't vote? Is it because they're clever and because
Yeah, there is. I'll say two things about this. There is a great experiment that was done in the early '90s by Andre Blay and Bob Young, and they took randomly selected classrooms of students, and they explained to some of them the paradox of voting, that their vote had no chance of making a difference and it made no sense, and to others they didn't explain this. And they decreased the turnout of those in the class who were exposed to the paradox, quite a measurable amount. So people who know about it are maybe a little bit less likely to vote. I can tell you I spent a lot of time trying to understand why young people don't vote. And the reasons why they don't vote are not that they're more cynical, their parents are more cynical than they are, they're not more disenfranchised, their parents are more disenfranchised than them. It has a little bit to do with information, a little bit to do with not being integrated in their communities, and a lot to do with the fact that they just don't feel that they have a duty to vote, that they've given up on a sense of greater social obligation either to their church or to their community or to the sort of democratic process.
What about the grassroots movements? So, I mean, you see a lot now, pretty much people moving away from voting, but trying to sort of subvert the political...
Totally overrated, that argument. Yeah, there's not a substitution effect. The people who are engaging in grassroots stuff they vote more than people who don't engage in grassroots stuff, so there's not a substitution there. And the rate at which, young people are voting at a rate of 3 in 10 or something, and it's not that the remaining 3 in 10 that would make up the difference between them and their parents are out waving signs. Yeah. So there's no consolation in that argument, unfortunately. Yeah.
Back row.
So thanks for the good talk. It's really interesting. I hear you sort of using 2 different models for rationality when you talk about this. So you give the example of the ball and earn experiment, and then you also talk about people who are more likely to discount immediate gains for future gains to be the voters. So which one of those 2 are the rational ones? The ones who are taking the long-term goal and accepting that they're not going to maybe have a deciding vote,
right,
or not?
So to be clear, because I suppose I wasn't, in both of those cases, you can identify people who violate strict economic rationality. Those who choose red balls violate strict economic rationality. Those who take immediate payments over future payments with huge interest rates are also economically irrational. It's the irrational people on probability issues, so issues like pulling the ball, who are more likely to vote because they can't identify probabilities correctly. And then it's those who discount the future more sharply who are not voting because of reasons of discounting benefits from elections. So if you think about elections being a combination of benefits and likelihood of receiving those benefits, both of those things can work on both of the parts of that model.
I wanted to ask you about Australia. I was quite shocked when I found out they have compulsory voting in Australia, and even more shocked to find out from liberal academic colleagues there that they were defending that, there are big fines and so on if you don't vote. And I was trying to think of why that shocked me, and I think it's because, some of the work with Mark Warrens and others on being able to vote with your feet, that withholding your vote as a kind of a statement as well. And I'm just wondering how Australia and how the idea of voting with your feet in some countries like Canada, how that plays into this kind of research that you're discussing.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say about Australia which I think are very interesting to me. I mean, one is that people are compelled to go to the polling booths but not vote, so they frequently cast what they call donkey votes, where they just write the numbers down the ballot, or they spoil their ballot. The second thing is that compulsory voting was not an initiative of the left in Australia, right? It was an initiative of the right. That when the Labour Party was in the ascendancy, and when it demonstrated its capacity for mobilizing its voters to come to the polls, propertied class said, this is a problem. These people are going to vote. So we have to find a way to compel the middle class and the property class to vote, to offset this. So they compelled them through fines. So it's a very democratic thing in the sense that it compels everyone to express, to follow their democratic duty of participating. But in its origins, it wasn't the grandest thing, and clearly it drags a lot of uninformed people to the polls. Yeah. And as you say, it doesn't allow for the expression of dissatisfaction through non-participation.
So it seems to me you're really looking at this from the angle of like an individual's perspective and preferences, and I guess I'm wondering what you think the role of social norms is, and I'm thinking of like the organ donation studies where they look at countries where donating your organs is like the default versus not, and how that has this drastic impact on whether people do it, and is that really because we care more or less about others, or is it just default social norm, and whether that could apply to a single student?
Yeah, let me tell you very quickly about the best experiment that demonstrates social pressure in voting. So Don Green and Alan Gerber and Chris Larimer did an experiment in Michigan in 2008 in which they obtained voting records about individuals. In the United States, your voting record is public. So I can go to the Secretary of State in your state and I can know when you voted in every election for which you've been eligible. They sent letters to people, and some of the letters said, we just want to remind you of your duty to vote. Your duty to vote. They had a condition where they let people know that they could know whether they voted. So they said, here's a production of your voting record for the last number of years, and we want you to know we're going to be seeing whether you vote in the next election. And then in the third condition, they sent people their neighbors' electoral participation records. And they said, we're going to send this letter updated to everyone in the neighborhood after the election. And you can increase civic voter turnout by about 3 percentage points by reminding people of their civic duty, 4 percentage points by letting them know that you're watching them, and something like 8 percentage points, or 33% of the base rate, by telling them that you're going to tell their neighbors. So clearly social sanctioning and shame is a huge part of voting. Yeah.
Although I think that's slightly different than purely, if people just thought 90% of my neighborhood is going to vote versus 30%,
Sure. But it's hard to make it the default option. I mean, the beauty of that organ donation thing is that you don't know you're donating your organs, right? Because you sign up for a driver's license and you don't tick the box that says, don't harvest my organs. Right. And it's like all the emails you get in your box when you don't unsubscribe to a list.
I don't think we can change it necessarily.
No, it'd be fun to try.
I was wondering how much of the voting behavior is influenced by massive political campaigns, because I was thinking that in countries like Colombia, a lot of people get to vote because politicians are going and promising, if you vote, I give you rights. Right. And I guess they're dumb, but they actually go and vote. So.
Well, look, in societies that allow for the provision of or the transfer of private goods to people in exchange for their voting is actually rather rational. And there's a good argument to be made in the Canadian case that a lot of the decline in turnout, particularly in some provinces from the mid-1950s to the mid-1980s, is the inability of politicians to transfer private goods to people, whether it was in the form of alcohol or $5 bills in Nova Scotia, or government jobs for a member of their family. And that was actually things which were commonly distributed in Canadian elections, particularly in the form of jobs, not to everyone, but a job to a family member on a paving crew or a snow plowing crew until the mid-1980s, early 1990s. And that has something to do with demobilization of Canadian voters. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, your finding about the care for others, are you feeling that this is the main reason for people to vote, or is this one significant factor that you may be missing than the others?
Yeah.
Real big thing that is
So if you wanted to know the greatest hits list, it would be in no order: concern for others, duty, That is, whether you feel that voting is a moral act in a Kantian sense, where it's a categorical imperative, you ought to do it regardless of whether people are watching. Those two, and then the third would be whether you voted before. So if I can accidentally drag you to the polls once, I can get you to vote for the rest of your life, right? Or at least with a much higher likelihood. So it's the combination of those three things.
I wonder if there's a kind of cynicism effect on the non-voters of the following kinds. My district is so gerrymandered that my vote is certainly not going to count. Or I'm going to vote for Ralph Nader because I haven't figured out yet that will lose Al Gore a decisive number of votes. Or I'm going to vote for James Green because I haven't figured out that he's a different person from Jim Green, candidates for the mayorship in Vancouver a number of years ago, handily won by Sam Sullivan, who may or may not have been paying for James Green's office space. In short, the system itself is not perfectly honest as manipulated by the people in charge of the system.
I think there's a lot to be said for people being doubtful of whether their vote will make a difference. In most cases, it doesn't make a difference, even under the best of circumstances, right? Even if everything is above board, the likelihood of your vote being decisive is still, let's say, remarkably low. But I should say that all of the research that I've done leads me to believe that justifications for not voting, which are based in cynicism, are simply justifications and not reasons. That these are most often the reasons given by people who would not bother to vote otherwise, feel some residual guilt over it, and wish to reconcile their self-image as a good person with that little bit of guilt they have inside of them. So.
On the record, would you predict that there's going to be a significantly higher voting turnout in Toronto at the next mayoral election?
Yes. Yeah.
How does this align with the equation you put out?
Well, I suppose that people have a fairly acute sense on one side of what happens when they don't vote, and with Rob Ford. And I want to just say, in defense of the 47% of Torontonians who voted for the man, and I live downtown, right downtown, in the most non-Rob Ford district. And I hear neighbors and colleagues talking all the time about who voted for this guy. And 1 in 5 people in my district voted for Rob Ford in the last election. So it's not just a suburban thing, and there's a lot of snobbery around it. And I suspect, I didn't vote for the man, but I suspect that there'll be a good bit of people who did support him and feel the hard edge of that snobbery and that elitism will be out in droves as well. So it'll be fun to watch, if not to live under for 4 years afterwards. Yeah.
Last question, right there.
What do you think are the practical implications of the results of your research, and if these are the results, how do we get people to vote? And my second question is, do you think that empathy plays a different or maybe a larger role in other forms of political participation, like participation in campaigns and volunteering for campaigns, as opposed to just voting?
Yeah. So on the first point, we can increase turnout by A, or let's say B, by making it clear to people that they can better other people by voting, and A, by teaching less math in school. So one of those is recommended, and the other is just a logical consequence. And on the second point, I think empathy is a fundamental driver of political opinion, of preference, of participation in some sense. And I think voting is one of the main areas where it's expressed. I think the reasons why people get involved in campaigns and in other things has as much to do with reasons of social circumstance and a desire for change as it does for kind of an underlying low-level abiding empathy for other people. That's a good question.
All right, I think a lot of people are going to be looking to sit by our speaker at lunch.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Rob.